So far in our course, we've covered a lot of the tools in the Effects Tools tab in Lightwave 11. Flocking, for instance, hypervoxels, even fiber effects for creating fur. But one area we've not is the bullet dynamics. This is a very nice new feature in Lightwave 11, creating very easy and accurate dynamics. And what are dynamics? Well, let's take a look. Let's go here to Modeler Tools, and let's just simply add a ground plane. And just use the defaults, and I'll save this so that way you'll be able to load up this scene. And of course, in the objects, that's what we want, so that's great. So we'll just call this dynamic, not dynamic ground plane. And we'll hit OK. Nice ground plane. Then we'll add just a torus, always a good one. Click OK. And I'm going to Shift H, get my size tool, and let's just size that down. And let's press the T key, and let's move that up and zoom it out. Simple, right? It's even simpler. If you wanted to animate this in the past, bouncing or something, there's two ways to do it. Number one is, of course, just keyframing it, and it's here, boom, and you'd set up the keyframes. You can press the motion options and add a modifier called gravity. And gravity is pretty nice because once you double click, you can add a strength of 1, and gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. So just by simply doing that and pressing the play button, you've got gravity. And of course you can change the amount of bounce and elasticity, and this is still very useful. But that's about all you can do with it. So let's do it another way with the bullet dynamics. So in the Effects Tools tab, we're going to come over, and what we have to do is basically identify each object as what they are. So this one right here will simply be a rigid body. This one right here is a static body. And you can see that the category is collision. So you want it to collide. You want that torus to collide with something. Well, you need a collision. Now, I'll talk about kinematic bodies in a little bit, but dynamic bodies are ones that are going to move and break apart. But essentially, collision bodies are ones that are not. Let's rewind this, press the play button, and we've got some gravity working. So a little bit different than our gravity plugin that made it bounce. Now you can see it still kind of goes through the ground there. Well, part of that has to do with the fact that this is just one big flat polygon. It needs actually a little bit more geometry in there. So let's do this. Let's just delete this. Modeler Tools, Geometry, Ground Plane, and let's add some segments to it across the X and Y. And we'll save this as Dynamic Plane 2. We'll take that back to the Effects Tools and make it a static body. This one we still have already identified as a rigid body, and we'll press play. Now you can see that it actually sits on the ground more, doesn't fall through it, because we have a little bit more geometry there for the system to calculate more accurately. Notice that when we do that, it triangulates everything. Okay, that's not going to affect your render at all, but the system actually can work a little bit better for you because it sees more geometry. So something to keep in mind. You don't need very dense objects, but you do need something there. All right, so what else can you do with this? Well, one thing that's fantastic is fracture. So I'm going to select this body, and I'm going to change it to a parts body just by clicking on it. Notice that you suddenly see this volume around it. I'm also going to click Fracture. And here is a new fracture tool. Random seed cell count. We're going to leave it at 200. We're going to break it into many, many pieces, and that's what this value does here. We're going to save this, click OK, rewind, and give it a second here. So the only issue with this and some of the other effects tools is that you're not quite sure when it's calculating. So if new tech, you're listening, we need a little kind of display down here perhaps that tells us what's going on. But now let's hit the play button again. You'll see it takes a little bit longer to calculate, but you'll see why in just a moment. Okay, so I've let it just kind of process a little bit, and now you can see that that torus does a great job of just falling and crashing and breaking up thanks to bullet dynamics and then the fracture tool mixed in. And it was that easy. You can simply just tell this to be static. This is a parts body, and then put on fracture and press the play button. And it had to calculate a little bit, but it didn't take more than a few minutes. Now, it's not fully calculated here, so it actually kind of is hanging a little bit until it can process the rest of that motion. I have a default 300 frame scene, but this is not just where you can stop. I'm going to rewind this and press Command or Control S, and we'll call this Fracture 1. We'll save that. I'm going to go to Modeler Tools. Let's add a cube. And the width would be maybe 0.4, 0.4, 0.4. And let's put a segment of 3 on each. And we'll save this just as Fracture Cube. And we'll click OK. So now we have a cube in the scene. Two things can happen. I can leave it here, or I can move it and have it fall as well. So let's just leave it here, like that. Frame 0. How do we want this to be handled? Well, I want this also to be a parts body, because we're going to break it up. I also want it to be a fractured object, but not as much. Maybe just 8, like that. We'll hit Save Object. And what this will also do is create an interior surface. So you can give it a surface name. So I could say Cube Inner Surface. And this will appear in our surface editor. Now, I'm going to hit play again. And everything's got to recalculate. But it does it on the fly. So the more processing power you have in your system, the more RAM you have in your system, all that's going to take effect. I do not have a lot of RAM in this system or a lot of processing power, so it takes a little bit longer. But what's happening, though, is that not only did that fall and fracture, once it hit, it actually broke the cube. And because the cube only had, let's say, 8 fractures, I think I put in there, it breaks that as well. Looks great. Okay, we're going back to Modeler Tools, Geometry. Let's add a sphere. And 500 millimeters is fine. 24 and 12 is fine. We'll just save that, and we'll also call this Fracture Sphere. Now this one we don't necessarily need to break up, but I'm going to maybe scale it down a little bit. And I'll press the T key. We're going to move this up. And I'm going to leave it here at 65 and also create a key for it at 0. I just press return to get my create key. Now, if I hit calculate on this one, it's going to fall immediately with everything else. Even though I created a frame at 65, the dynamics will override that. So I'm going to open in the effects tools the item properties. And in here, you can have very specific control over all of your motions. Now, the default ones that I just showed you, just by literally saying you're static, you're rigid, go, work really well. But if you want a little more control, you open the item properties right there. Open this up a little bit so you can see it. For this ball, we need to have it inside our Bullet Dynamics engine. We haven't set that yet. Well, this is really just a rigid body. That's all we're doing. And once we do that, it adds it into our dynamic engine. And all we really want to do with this is tell it, don't activate until the last keyframe. And let's give this a second to catch up. Because every change, this is working live in the background, so every change you make is calculating. So I'm going to go here to activation for the sphere, and don't start it active like the other ones. Activate on last key. The last key is frame 65. Okay, so if you have a scene together like this and you're working and it's obviously more complex, you can come in here and turn off dynamics altogether so you can get the rest of your scene set up so it's not always calculating. Turn that back on when you're ready to go. We'll close this out and we'll say File, Save Scene as Fracture 2. And let's hit the play button, see how we did. Falls, cracks, and now that holds and falls and rolls around. And what's great is that they all see each other. Now, there's a little bit of wobble there in the ball and in the rocks, and we can change that in the properties. I've also noticed that the fracture starts right away simply because we did not add activate on last key. We actually activated it right from the start, so it's automatically starting to crack. And that's okay because it can show you that as soon as the scene starts, it cracks. But it's not going to move really because, well, nothing's pushing it and we've applied no dynamics to it in any way. So once these elements fall on top, they push it. So that comes down and cracks, falls apart. The ball comes down and actually smashes it even more, which is great, and then rolls around. And also notice that the pivot on the ball is based on the bottom. We can actually move that so it rolls a little bit better right from the center, but it's working okay. So there's a little bit of jitter here. It's always an issue with dynamics, whether it's the old Lightwave Dynamics engine or this new Bullet one. So what you can do for that, and I'm just going to make sure the scene is saved, is open up the item properties, and then let's turn off dynamics for the time being. What I'm going to do for the Taurus, because that's the one that's broken up in all those parts, if you look at some of the properties here, there's mass method is set to volume density, and that's fine. That's working just fine for us. You can set it to the area or point density where it's more accurate, or a given mass if we want to enter in a value. Great if you've got heavy balls or cannon, things like that. But the density is fine. There's friction. We have a 50% friction. The bounciness seems okay, but I think really it's the friction we're going to want to work with. So I'm going to change it to 10. We're going to enable dynamics. All right, and now we scroll through here. You can see it coming down and crashing. Let's hit the play button, see it in real time. And now we're seeing a lot less jitter. There's still some there, but all these ones up here are actually staying pretty well. So we'll come back in here. We can bring the bounciness down. We don't need them to bounce as much. Bring that down to about 10, and I'll bring friction down to about 2%. And again, we'll hit the play button. It's going to have to recalculate. We'll let it come down. So here comes, crashes, and because of the less friction and the less bounce, now you actually see those pieces flying out even more. Okay, still a little jitter in there. So a balance of these will work really well. 10%, and maybe the bounciness bring back up to 20, and so on. And we can dampen areas, maybe 10% linear and a 10% angled. And let's increase the glue strength to about 30%. And then we'll get out of there. Rewind and let it calculate again. Boom. Comes down. Now they don't travel out as much. And you can see there's a lot less jitter in there as well. So a very quick overview of the Bullet Dynamics. A great way to crash, blow things up. So let's go on to the next video and put them to use in a little more practical sense.